Okay, can I just check that I'm audible and visible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Great, thank you so much. In the instances where states have failed so badly that they require a national bailout, we would rather a reliable international actor come and take control. There are a few points of setup I'm going to do. Firstly, on what the IMF is likely to do. Secondly, some preemption on the characterization of IMF. And lastly, on the incentives of the IMF. The first thing we think the IMF is going to do is things like set up financial institutions that are able to assume the central control of a country. So, for example, banks that are able to control the exchange rate and the interest rate. I think the second thing they are likely to do is tell the government which sectors to spend their money in or how to allocate their spending. We think they are also likely to, for example, have things like discussions with member countries, with technocrats, and with the government of the country itself in order to examine the circumstances of the country. So, for example, deciding the current government budget, whether the industries are sunrise or sunset industries, in order to decide on a suitable course of action. Second point of setup then on some mitigation on the characterization of IMFs. We think OP is likely to point to past failures of the IMF. There are 2 points of mitigation. The first is that in many instances of these failures, the IMF did not have direct controls. What they were forced to do is set certain conditions that governments were relatively free to carry out as they pleased. In many instances, this meant that governments took their own independent actions that led to poor economic situations. But secondly, we think the IMF has also improved greatly of late. They have learned from the examples of Greece, for instance, in order to re-examine their financial policies. But the last one is set up on the direct incentives of IMF. There are 4 reasons why we think the IMF is likely to have incentives to be a good actor and to improve the economic situation of the country. The first is on their reputation. We think the fact that they're an international body that is heavily scrutinized means that they have an incentive to make sure that their policies are successful. But we think also the additional framing here is that the IMF is aware that there are arising competitors now. So, for example, BRICS is trying to set up competing like financial institutions that are able to provide bailouts, as well as countries like China that are necessarily malicious actors that the IMF now has to compete against. Because of the awareness that people can seek alternative sources for loans, this is why the IMF is likely to be inclined to make themselves a credible and like attractive alternative to firstly make themselves very effective, and secondly that they are unlikely to be extremely punitive in the kind of monetary policies they set out simply because they are aware of the need to attract countries to them rather than to other actors. The second incentive is that they are also beholden to donor countries, so the countries that provide them money for these bailouts, like countries like the US that are necessarily invested in the IMF, want them to be successful. We think they are beholden to these countries. The third incentive is that they want to remove the need for future bailouts. So they want to quickly install stability within these countries such that their economy is able to function sustainably and on its own, so that they don't have to put in massive amounts of money to keep repeatedly bailing them out. But lastly, we also think that the IMF recognizes the need for cooperation with these countries in order to necessarily get the outcomes that they want. Moving on to my arguments then on why the IMF is better equipped to help the economy. I have 3 premises here. The first premise on why states are bad actors. There are 3 reasons for this. The first is that there is already a precedent of failure. The fact that you need a national bailout means that your economy has collapsed. Your economy is literally unable to sustain itself. Most of your people are living within abject poverty. You no longer have any financial institutions within your own country. This looks like countries like Venezuela, which is facing massive inflation rates and where most people are unable to afford basic necessities. This has 2 implications. The first is that the country is incredibly ill-equipped because only countries with institutions that are necessarily unable to stand up to the task of running a country would land themselves in a situation where they require national bailouts. The second implication is that there is a lack of public buy-in to the government. Because the people perceive that the government is the one who has put them in this horrible economic situation, this is likely to have 2 outcomes. The first is that you get less cooperation with economic policies because people simply don't perceive your government as the one that should be controlling the monetary policy. The second is that you're likely to lead to a lot of things like panic buying at a point at which people perceive that the economy is failing and that the government is incredibly incompetent. This lack of faith and disillusionment with the government is likely why the people within these countries are likely to perceive the IMF as a good or at least as a preferable actor. This preempts whatever Ott might say about people perceiving IMF as like an imposition of neocolonialism. We think they are likely to see it as a welcome alternative to their incredibly incompetent governments that have landed them in poverty. The second reason why states are bad actors is because of things like political instability. This debate takes place in 2 scenarios. Firstly, things like dictatorships and illiberal democracies, where the leaders at the top of the country are often use the extract the country's resources in order to enrich themselves, often engage in horrible economic policy to, for example, fund a war. We think all of these means that they are unlikely to come up with monetary policies that is actually very good for the country and that actually cares about the common individual, because there are also no checks and balances against them. And we think it is at the point where they have already implemented monetary policy that is incredibly bad that they will seek the IMF as their only alternative. The second scenario in which this debate takes place is things like nascent democracies, so extremely new democracies that are still relatively unstable. We think in these scenarios, there is likely to be a lot of political turnover, there is likely to be a lot of political infighting. This has two implications. Firstly, things like deadlocks in parliaments, that means that these states are unable to decide on like a cohesive monetary policy. But secondly, also because of the amount of political turnover, there is unlikely to be a lot of continuity within these policies. These policies are likely to be reversed with each political term when a new person comes into power and has a different idea for how they want the economy to run. But the last reason for why states are bad actors is that they also have competing priorities. So for example, the need to ensure ethnic harmony, the need to secure their borders, all of these things means that they are likely to be less focused on monetary policies. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
A lot of your impacts can be achieved via fiscal control. Why does it require monetary policy?
Okay, I'll talk about that later on in my speech on why direct control is important, but we think there are two main reasons for this. The first is that direct control means that you are not vulnerable to political pushback. This is unique because we think that the alternative is that the IMF has to rely on, for example, advising these actors or has to rely on like less controlling mechanisms like what you said about fiscal policies. We think these things are likely to be inefficient at the point at which we've already established that these countries are incredibly politically unstable and there's likely to be a lot of like infighting as to how they carry out these IMF advice. We think it is best that the IMF can assume direct control to circumvent the instability here. But the second is that we think there is an ability to carry out central planning when you have monetary control. This is something that the government is unlikely to do given their incentive structure of short-term outcomes. We think this means that the IMF is then able to do things like decide which sector that they want to invest in, for instance. But why is the IMF then a good actor? Three reasons. The first is that they just have far more knowledge. So the fact that they are such a renowned institution means that they have access to things like the highest and most qualified academics. They have access to things like the ability to carry out large-scale research into the context of these countries and figure out which policies will work. The second is on stability. We think because they are able to establish monetary control, this means that they are able to establish a high degree of continuity. And the last thing on long-term outcomes, we think unlike governments which are beholden to like the immediate outcomes because they, for example, want to get re-elected in these nascent democracies, the IMF is able to do things that might be politically unpopular in the short run, like, for example, having massive investments into industries, but that reap a lot of benefits in the long run. All these reasons, OG.
All right, thank you for that speech, Prime Minister. Now calling on the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay, give me a quick second. Okay, starting my speech in 3, wait, whoa. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do a few miscellaneous rebuttals first before I move into my substantive onto OG. The first thing that OG describes here is that there's generally a blame associated to a failed government, that you can associate the blame, past failures of the IMF, to the fact that governments have failed in the past to enact IMF policies. I think this is entirely like a strange burden shift, because recognize that when these countries are requiring IMF bailouts within the first place, they're probably in a weaker negotiating space in order for them to discuss whether or not they can or will impose these policies. I think the point in which that you are relying on IMF for a bailout within the first place means two prior characterization criteria need to be met, right? Number one is that your government is largely going to be willing to comply to certain degrees of the measures that the IMF is going to impose onto you because of the fact that you require this consistent funding and further developmental funds and trust with the IMF in order for them to acquire these loans and maintain good working relationships with the IMF in the future. Number two, it means that, like, generally speaking, these states are at a capacity in which that they are willing to self-reflect on existing failures and how to better these states, right? Note here that I think that the characterization given in OG about like Venezuela and such failed states that are like completely incapable, that just take the IMF loan and do absolutely shit all about the conditions, is something that's extremely unrealistic, right? Existing autocratic and autocratic and dictatorial regimes that are failed states that drive up high degrees of inflation rates that cause massive economic suffering to the people are not individuals who take loans from the IMF. Like, that's not something that happens in the current day. Maybe in the 90s, but not the current day. What these dictators and these autocrats do in the current present day, when they do have failed economies, is result to like other authoritarian and dictatorial actors who come in and provide them funds to do the activities and to embezzle the state funds, right? So in fact, the IMF, by adopting these policies that strip away individual countries of sovereignty and decision making, actually deter individuals from cooperating with the IMF and adopting best practices, because what these individuals turn to is the competitors of the IMF that currently exist within the global order that we have today. The Asia Development Bank, we resort to China, we resort to Russia and other more malicious state actors, which care much less about democratic control, which care much less about how the world is supposed to work. But let's move on to substantive. I think direct control is a contradiction of the consensus-based decision-making, the new liberal world order that has become representative of the IMF and UN agencies in the Western world in general, that we have spearheaded since the end of World War II. There's only the one main material I want to push here is, why is sovereignty necessarily the most important clash in this debate, and you need to prioritize this, right? The first to note that international law and obligations have to function based on an understanding of equal sovereignty between the nations, because a vacuum of this respect results in an opt-out of nations to opt into your world order. What this means, we learned this from the failure of unequal treaties and century of humiliation in China. We learned this from the failures of establishing a democratic society in post-World War II Germany. A powerlessness of the state that is perceived widely by the people results in the rise in anti-globalists, it results in a rise in isolationism, it results in a rise in authoritarianism. The IMF collaborationist states that are currently existing in status quo, they are asking for or receiving funds and bailouts, are governments who have some fault certainly, but are still effectively sovereign governments that should not have independent measures imposed onto them, right? In fact, I think it is increasing rarity that governments want to opt into the IMF in any ways within the current status quo, because of the fact that alternatives exist, such as the ADB, such as China. What this results in is that three impacts, right? The first impact is that I think IMF measures are likely going to be divorced from local populist measures, right? So what, as OG describes, IMF measures are likely going to shake up existing financial institutions or shake up the ways in which the state currently distributes resources, or even if they do not do that, it's going to determine or have a large degrees of deviation in existence with the existing monetary policy that exists within the state. What this means is that individuals who currently existingly rely on these institutions are going to be individuals who are turned away the most, and I think large degrees of the population are going to be ones who are used to the existing economic staticism of what the state naturally looks like. I think this results in worse outcomes, right? Because I understand that the IMF is fundamentally not a democratic institution. It is a financial institution that is beholden primarily to its stakeholders and its financial contributors, and those are the individuals that hold largest degree of sway in it. And oftentimes this does not include the individuals to which that they're providing the funds to. And I think that shift in incentive primarily requires that you oftentimes do measures that benefit your stakeholders or benefit larger international world order at the expense of local individual populations, right? This is particularly harmful because, number one, I think it results in a loss of legitimacy in the IMF, right? Because if opting into the IMF no longer requires complex treaties and negotiations and the ultimate sovereignty of the government, and rather it is direct control of the IMF towards your existing state banks' monetary policy, I think what that results in is that individuals see their state as one that's effectively powerless. I'll note here that the IMF is not a welcome party in most states who are asking for these loans, right? We are looking at post-colonial states, we're looking at states in degrees of state failure, but what that particularly means is that they're probably wary of the existing existing international pressures and colonialist narratives that they're coming around, right? Sure, the IMF might be seen as competent, but the point in which that you say these competent people is going to be in charge of all degrees of policy within the state is the point in which individuals are likely to feel that their state is powerless against back and forth with the IMF, right? You can say that IMF will consult with these with state actors, but at the end of the day, it is the IMF who holds the ultimate arbitrating power. In fact, it's probably better on our side if the IMF is going to consult with them anyways, where our state, on the comparative at the very least, has some degree of rationality and ability to decide whether how these policies are going to be carried out. Before I move on, CG.
Yeah, so far, your entire speech is also applicable to the fiscal conditions that the IMF sets on countries it lends to, if not more so, because in that case, it's overriding the sovereignty of Parliament to do things like increase spending. Do you support fiscal conditions in this debate?
As long as it is within the sovereignty of the state to ultimately decide how it is going to be enacted, I think it's fine. Like the IMF come in and consult and provide certain degrees of conditions, but whether or not these conditions are actually implemented is something that states have to assess the risk of and like decide on as a matter of economic policy. But the last thing here that I want to note is that IMF reputation is not golden, right? We have protests against the IMF all the time in every single state that's received like funding from it because of the fact that there's a perception that it's a new colonial power, because of the fact that the Western powers have gained dominance over the rest of society, over the rest of the global world order for so far. What this leads in is political instability, right? Individuals feel like the existing government is like therefore powerless, and I think that that results in large degrees of regime change and political instability in states. I think that's very, very highly bad for like the outcomes in economic outcomes of the state in general. I think the IMF is likely to accelerate failure in these regards because of the fact that individuals will lose trust in existing institutions and therefore opt for more dangerous and more isolationist alternatives. But the last thing I want to talk about is that like the reputational fallout, right? Because if you impose a new seemingly toxic and direct control over one part of your policy, it signals and indicates to the rest of the world that this is the direction that the IMF is holding over. It is principled in the IMF foundation, in the foundations of IMF, that we do know better than you, and hence this policy is seen by many as one that can extend into other forms of fiscal policy, which is why we must never take this step because of the fact that it will taint our reputations for years to come. Yeah.
All right, thank you for that speech, Leader of Opposition. Now calling on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, can you check that everyone can hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
The first thing I want to talk about is the tension in OO's case, because by their metric, if governments were so willing to listen to the IMF orders, if they were so willing to cooperate, then I think the breach on sovereignty that they want to claim isn't going to be to the extent that they want to talk about. So they either have to pick one and like settle with it, right? But I think more importantly, I'm going to do two things in my speech. First thing I'm going to rebut a lot of what O wants to tell you. I'm going to tell you why their frame is just completely irrelevant and why it doesn't engage with a lot of what Ashley tells you. The second thing I'm going to forward a positive material here on increased involvement and aid from member countries, increased cooperation in the global economy as a whole. On to the first thing on just like some rebuttals, right? I think the first thing that O wants to tell you is that governments are willing to comply with the IMF. I think this is just simply not true, for the main reason that oftentimes governments in countries like this often care about their political reputation more than they care about listening to the orders of the IMF, right? But I think even if you don't buy this, we posited to you in Ashley that it was never really about the fact that the government was willing to comply or not. It was rather that they never had the capacity, they didn't know how to start, and the IMF couldn't step in these situations because they didn't want to breach on the sovereignty of these countries, even though these countries desperately needed help. We told you that that was the main problem here. We told you that these instances could only ever be fixed with direct control. The second thing that OO then tells you is that, oh no, but you don't actually need monetary policy in order to help these countries at all. I think that actually leaves out a lot of what Ashley wants to tell you, right? Because we told you that monetary policies were very, very important because things like exchange rate, they're important because they directly affect the way that countries want to trade with you, whether or not they believe that the terms of trade are favorable to them. Things like interest rates policies are important because it directly affects consumer spending. These are policies that require direct control from the IMF because only the IMF has the foresight and the knowledge to know when to implement these policies, to know how to implement these policies effectively for the maximum effect. We think that oftentimes nascent democracies simply don't have the resources, they don't have the knowledge to do these things. They're still trying to figure things out. We told you that insofar as the IMF refuses to step in, these countries will continue to suffer. The second thing I want to take down then is that this idea that like, oh, dictators just go to like other dictators, the reputation of the IMF is really, really bad, right? But I think the first thing I want to tell you here is that this loss of legitimacy in the IMF argument is just not really relevant. It's just complete nonsense, given that we already told you that the IMF reputation is usually just contingent on whether or not they are able to help countries or not. We don't think the loss of legitimacy here is that significant. But I think the more important thing I want to weigh out here is on their main argument on sovereignty, right? They tell you about this principle of sovereignty. Assuming that we ignore the tension in their case here, I think ultimately the reason why we should value sovereignty is because we want to take care of citizens, right? We want citizens to have a good life. But the comparative on their side here is that people continue to suffer. People live in poverty. People continue to not have food on their table. They continue to worry about whether or not they have lunch, whether or not they can find a new job, just because the country cares about sovereignty. We think sovereignty is less important than the direct and intense proximate harms to the average citizen. We already told you here that we think that citizens are likely to accept the IMF's help given the abject state of poverty that they are likely to live in. Even if they don't accept the IMF's help, even if they are paranoid, even if they are worried, we think that practical benefits that are derived directly from the IMF stepping in with direct control is something that will take over citizens' paranoia every day. We think that in the long term, they will come to accept the IMF. We think sovereignty here is less important in this debate. We don't really see why sovereignty is an absolute principle that we should follow at all costs, right? Moving on to the extension then on increased cooperation in the global economy. And I'm going to integrate the rebuttal here because what opposition wants to tell you is that, oh no, on our side, people will just go to China and Russia anyways. The first line of response here is that understand that if countries if they really hated the USA and they really wanted to go to Russia and China, they would have just gone there anyways. I think ultimately the debate here will always be about nascent democracies who want help, who want to enter the global economy, but they don't know how to do so. We think that ultimately this debate cannot be about the most extreme actors in this debate, right? So the context for this substantive is very, very simple. We think that currently in status quo, member countries under the IMF are a bit hesitant to step in to help failed states outside of the IMF precisely because they are afraid precisely because of the fact that they are afraid that their efforts mean nothing, right? We told you that in status quo, the IMF currently sets conditional aid in status quo. They can only give advice, and this advice is usually ignored or unfulfilled given the rough political landscape, given short-termist leaders, given the fact that these individuals don't have the capacity to actually create change. This is all the context and framing that Ashley wants to tell you. But the second thing here is that we told you that there is often a disconnect and disjunct between the monetary policy that the governments in these countries chooses to adopt. We told you that oftentimes countries don't know how to run citizens don't know how to run, governments don't know how to run these failed states properly. And as a result, we told you that a lot of times member countries in the IMF are very hesitant to step in because they don't know the degree of their influence in that country. They don't know if they're actually going to be able to help these countries, given that these countries don't seem to have the capacity to help themselves to begin with. But the mechanism here is very, very simple. So what changes on outside? We told you that direct control then gives member countries more faith in their ability to intervene and receive pay out for their investment and receive payout for their aid, right? Because oftentimes we told you that the delta here is that the reputation of the IMF, right? We told you that the IMF right now is seen as a very, very is seen as a reputable international body. We told you that insofar as the IMF is willing to step in and actually use direct control on these failed states, it is seen as an international body supporting these failed states. This in turn already gives confidence to member countries to step in and intervene because now they know that this is a country that the IMF is trying to help, that this is a country that probably is going to be able to pull itself out of its trenches because the IMF is there and willing to provide aid, right? We told you that this guaranteed cooperation that comes with the IMF, using direct control on these failed states, means that ultimately you are likely to get more aid from member countries. Why then is this aid likely to be good? First thing here is just very simply on international relationships, right? We told you that in the current global economy, oftentimes you want to seek out good and strong allies in order to protect yourselves. And here's where the rebuttal against this China and Russia argument steps in, right? Because we told you here that China is very, very punishing. We told you that oftentimes we don't want to oftentimes countries don't want to step in and actually go to China because China has extremely high interest rates. China is very, very punishing on the conditions that it sets on its allies. The comparative here is that when the IMF steps in, oftentimes these actors, member countries are likely to be good actors when it comes to providing aid. They do things like provide technocrats. They do things like ensuring that MNCs move into these countries and set up headquarters because they want to have a diversification of economies. They want to integrate global supply chains. They want to form up new industries. These alliances are good because oftentimes these unstable countries need allies to be integrated in the global economy for long-term stability. So here's where we actually co-opt long-term benefit, right? Because ultimately, even if the IMF is only in direct control for a short period of time, for a short term, you need to have the formation and establishment of strong financial systems and companies so that these companies can sustain in the long run. We tell you that these things can only happen insofar as countries outside of the IMF, countries are willing to step in and help these countries and cooperate with them and ally with them on their own accord without the IMF's interference. We think ultimately on our side, we get better global cooperation. Countries are able to build themselves up and actually sustain themselves in the long run. For all these reasons, OG.
All right, thank you for that speech, DPM. Now calling on the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
All right, give me a moment to set up. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
All right. Qua is verbal. Okay. Simon. 3, 2, 1. The problem with this OG case is they assume the worst of the states. They assume that states will never comply with the policies suggested by the IMF. They assume that the countries will never want to take the actions in order for them to be necessarily be able to rebuild the states in a post financial situation, right? Even at best, if the country is just incapable to do so. We don't think that's the case, right? Because we argue that the countries would try. There are a few layers of analysis as to why that works. The reasons as to the examples that OG gives you as to the previous failures of IMF bailouts shows exactly to states that are in these kinds of financial situations now, why they do not want to become the Greeks, that why they ought to follow more advice of the IMF in order for their economies to actually to be able to rebuild, right? The risk of never being able to get another IMF support again at the point at which you do not follow is another incentive as to why states do want to actually follow through the advice financial policies that the IMF may suggest. The delta here is the perception in how these economic policies are going to be implemented. I think what Cheng Zu tells you very importantly is that how the perception in which you are able to choose to implement the economic policies is important because it prevents the largest harms of political instability that harms the long-term sustainability of these countries, even if they actually have a good will to in good faith in want to implement these policies, right? It's because of the lower negotiation power is better than no negotiation power at all, that the choice to implement certain policies is seen as a decision that is made by the government as a sovereign entity rather than something that is imposed onto them by a foreign actor. These are the reasons why that people are going to actually want to go to the IMF, and we tell you that why in the absence of this, there's larger possibilities of these states and actors wanting to go to the worse alternatives that OG talks about, like the China and the Asian Development Bank. Right. And if the case is that the IMF knows best, presumably on both sides, the IMF will still come in. You can still consult on the economic policies in order for you to actually have the largest chance of success. But before I continue, sure. Or CG.
Yeah, so currently, when the IMF is offering a bailout to a country experiencing an inflationary crisis, how does the IMF use its control over fiscal policy to try and deal with that crisis?
So I think the problem is not how it takes. I will explain to you why the imposition of total control and their version of how the fiscal policy ought to be implemented is going to be way worse. But I think the important thing is just how states can still pick and choose the most important or the ways in which is most the most efficient and the most appropriate suited to their own economies, right? But then we'll move on to the extension of the economic harms or what happens when you have direct control, right? But the same incentives that OG gives you as to why the IMF has a need to succeed in order for them to maintain their reputation is exactly detrimental. They want to succeed and maintain their reputation means they oftentimes may have to sideline local needs in order for them to achieve their goal of being of implementing successful policy, right? What does this look like? Your success of success metrics actually looks like things like lowering inflation rate, likely look like servicing debts that have been owed by these states, right? What does this mean? When you have high interest rates, the ways in which you have to control inflation, but this also engages with what CG asked, is the fact that you ought to have raised higher interest rates for these banks or institutions that you're all going to set up. On surface, this looks like you likely going to you are able to implement these successfully, but this also means you're going to harm local businesses because these people cannot borrow money in order for them to actually have some form of sustainable businesses, right? But the second part of this is that the other part of how the IMF likely is going to bring in ways to boost up the economy, right? Likely going to rely on foreign investors, right? Likely going to have the targeted policies that attracts foreign direct investment in order for you to boost the economy, because that's just historically what the IMF knows how to do because of the member states that exist within the IMF. This means that this leads to twofold, because on surface it seems like it seems like an idea that is good because it boosts up the economy in the short term. But we tell you that because the IMF are eventually going to leave at some point, is going to leave these states under vulnerable to external shocks. When your economy is on all these external corporations, you don't have those kind of local industries being built up because the IMF wants to seem successful in the shortest amount of time, because either due to the lack of resources that they have in order for them to service multiple countries and bail out multiple countries in the same time, or they just want it to reflect that reflect good on them that they're able to complete these kind of things in a short time, right? This means that the long-term sustainability that OG wants to talk about doesn't exist, because maybe you get corporations, but then that means your exports are going to be heavily affected, because you often have these foreign companies exploit the weakened state of these countries in order to exploit the resources and exploit the workers and all these infrastructure that exist, right? This means you don't actually get those benefits, right? But next on how you likely the IMF imposing this likely means you're going to be focusing and shifting all of your resources into servicing your debt rather than on local development, right? This means that we're not saying that's completely a bad idea, that you ought to service certain debts in order for your economy to be successful again. But the important part of here is how your parliament gets to choose, how your parliament gets to decide how much to allocate. This means there is still trust within the system that people are not going to immediately try to overturn all these kinds of things, right? Your parliament still at the very least cares about the development to a certain degree in order for the people to actually still trust and continue to support in this fiscal policy and support in the IMF in the first place, right? I think the concession, we tell you that the concession of the full imposition is one that is bad, because if you concede that the IMF knows best, that only the IMF has the largest capacity and information, means that you have the idea on why shouldn't they control everything. The perception that this concession leads to all the political instability hubs, it leads to all the economic hubs that they talk about, and we don't think is something that the IMF should opt to do.
All right. Thank you so much for that speech, DLO. Now calling on the member of government. Here.
Cool. You guys can hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
Wonderful. And I'll take POIs in the chat. Closing government will make two extensions. Firstly, we will actually explain why the IMF specifically needs control over monetary policy and why that's preferable than them having control over only fiscal policy. And secondly, we'll explain why international actors prefer this and have more confidence in the economy, which leads to more foreign investment and also a greater likelihood of the IMF lending more money and being more lenient in restructuring in the first place. Firstly, a clarification. The IMF already, when it lends or when it does restructuring or bailouts, imposes conditions on a country's fiscal policy. So that's government spending. So what the IMF does in the status quo is does things like impose austerity measures and make restrictions on how much the government can borrow and how much the government can spend, including where the government should cut spending. For instance, it advises governments to do things like cut welfare spending or cut fuel subsidies, which it sees as fiscally imprudent. Monetary policy it refers to central banks setting interest rates or controlling the money supply, and that's specifically what the IMF is having control over in this debate. And the significance of this is that the opening half is extremely vague as to why the IMF should or shouldn't have control over monetary policy specifically, because both of their sets of arguments refer to things like Parliament having sovereignty, but that's something that is already being ceded when you have an IMF bailout and they set fiscal policy. Opening government's arguments aren't specifically about why the IMF needs control over monetary policy. They give a set of generic reasons as to why the IMF should have influence or not influence, but that analysis is unpersuasive. The second note I'd make about opening government is they're extremely contingent on central banks being awfully corrupt or bad at their jobs, and we'll explain why control over monetary policy is needed, even in the instance where central banks are acting more rationally or are better at their jobs. So, to begin with, why do you need control over monetary policy? The first context I want to talk about are inflationary crises. Those are the majority of instances when a default occurs. That's for a few reasons. Firstly, empirically, think about countries like Sri Lanka, Argentina, and Pakistan, where they all had high inflationary crises that led to them being unable to finance their currency pegs, that led to them defaulting. Why is inflationary crisis the most common scenario in which default occurs? Firstly, because when you have high inflation, the government collects less tax. That's for the reason that, you have bracket creep. So the amount of percentage of income that the government is collecting, each dollar that the government collects is worth less. Secondly, because when you have an inflationary crisis, your currency is worth less compared to those overseas because you can't buy as many things with your dollars. And importantly, most IMF debt is denominated in US dollars, which means the amount of money that the government has to spend to repay is much greater when you have an inflationary crisis. Thirdly, high government spending that induces inflation is linked to default, because you default when the government can't afford to service its debts anymore because it's borrowed too much and has to make too many interest payments and isn't collecting enough money compared to how much it's spending. And that specifically occurs when you have high spending that induces and causes inflation. So, in this context, why does the IMF need control over monetary policy in order to get the economy back up and going again? Firstly, it needs control over monetary policy to deal with inflation. The IMF will insist that these countries set high interest rates and restrict the money supply by doing things like financing the government spending, by doing less quantitative easing, or by doing more quantitative tightening. So that's to say the IMF is going to insist that you restrict the money supply by doing things like selling illiquid assets to banks, so there's less money going around in the economy, so each dollar is comparatively worth more. Why does that not happen right now when the IMF doesn't have control? Even if central banks are not corrupt or are not totally beholden to politicians, although we point out that they often are. See, for instance, Erdogan's control over the central banks in Turkey. We would say central banks are afraid to do things like set very high interest rates, firstly, because it is extremely unpopular and causes a high degree of short-term economic pain. It induces things like protests. But secondly, there is often political pressure not to do this because governments say that it will cause these sorts of protests or will hurt citizens very much. What's the alternative? How does the IMF deal? So that explains that the IMF is better at dealing with inflationary crises. But what's the alternative? The IMF tries to deal with inflationary crises by imposing very harsh fiscal austerity measures to try and reduce government spending, to try and reduce things like the government's printing money to finance its spending and to slow down the overheated economy or stop things like wage price spirals. The harm of that is, firstly, it's far less effective at dealing with inflation compared to higher interest rates or more contractionary monetary policy. And that's for the reason that monetary policy is much quicker at taking away money from where it is most needed, which is you take money away from banks who are lending it to the large corporations that are doing a lot of the spending. However, when you impose fiscal austerity, which is what the IMF tries to do in the status quo to deal with inflation, the impact is much slower because it takes a long time before those spending cuts kick in and before people actually have less money in their wallet. But secondly, the harm is that specifically when you do austerity measures instead of using higher interest rates, the harm is concentrated on the most vulnerable. The IMF will insist that you cut things like welfare because those group of people, the poorest people, are the people who have the highest marginal propensity to consume. That's to say they're the ones who spend the largest proportion of their money on things like consumer goods, which is what actually drives inflation, which is why the IMF insists that you cut things like fuel subsidies or welfare and takes money out of vulnerable people's pocket. What's the problem with this? The problem is when the IMF only has control over fiscal policy, central banks, when they're not controlled by the IMF, try to overcorrect for that austerity measure by doing things like setting low interest rates, which prolongs the inflationary crisis and worsens all of these harms. However, when the IMF has control over both, they're able to harmonize fiscal and monetary policy and deal with the crisis better in a way that hurts people less. And we'll note that in terms of the political popularity or losing control under either side, yes, high interest rates might be unpopular when they're being set by IMF, but that is far less unpopular compared to doing things like cutting Bolsa Familia in Brazil or cutting fuel subsidies that more directly put money in people's pockets, which is why this is actually less of a threat to country's sovereignty or makes people annoyed. Before I move on, I'll take OO. I'll take CO.
Sorry, clarification. Just to be clear, closing government wants both monetary and fiscal policy to be done by IMF, but only complete control over monetary policy.
No, the IMF, the status quo is maintained with fiscal policy, right? And on the either side, the IMF is setting conditions on the loan. So we're just giving the IMF the option to dictate monetary policy where it sees fit. For instance, where central banks are pursuing very stupid monetary policies like dollarization or direct debt monetization, like printing a huge amount of money to finance government spending. Under your side, they can only control one. Under our side, when they wish, they can control both. Next, on the context of recessions, the problem with a default in a recession under the side opposition is the IMF wants to be paid back. So it wants the government to do things like decrease borrowing or decrease spending and increase taxes. The problem with that is that's counter-cyclical, because in a recession, you need a lot of government spending to induce the economy and to get it going again. But the problem is the IMF still insists on austerity in that case to try and get paid back quicker. That's exactly what happened in Greece. Now, it's far better when we give the IMF control over interest rates and they can insist that the government sets low interest rates to stimulate growth, which comes less so at the trade-off of the IMF not being paid back. The problem and reason why central banks don't do this in the status quo is because oftentimes the vast majority of these countries maintain currency pegs and they can't afford, when they set low interest rates and their currency depreciates, to continue to finance that peg, so they don't do that. It's far better in the status under our side.
All right, thank you for that speech, member of government. Now calling on the member of opposition. Here.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
Give me 1 second. I assume you can see me as well.
Yep,
just
you're
to
visible now.
Thanks. Just to clarify, I take PRIs in the chat. Try not to don't unmute. CO will have two entrances into debate. First, why the IMF must opt into less intrusive methods in order to appear more palatable and appear more strategic as options for countries to opt in, rather than making countries default to no alternative and ultimately landing their economies in worse areas. But secondly, and directly contending with CG, why the focus on monetary policy is incredibly unstrategic for the levels of things that the IMF is willing to do. Responses to most houses will be integrated. First, why must the IMF opt into less intrusive mechanisms? And the frame here that the opening side refuses to agree on, and broadly CG falls into the same trap, is this idea of balance as to what exactly countries' leaders or nascent democracies actually want in terms of their monetary policy or in terms of their ability to be political. And I think it's very important to note that the vast majority of leadership in countries requires some level of balance, or want some level of balance to begin with. First, in the nature of which you have like debt crises or recessions, very oftentimes what a country's leadership wants to do is salvage their economy to some level instead, which is why they're already primed and ready to take IMF loans and listen to some level of conditions. So don't listen to OG, don't listen to like any house that tries to tell you that it's one of the extreme. It's like either they are super susceptible to IMF conditions or they're like completely insusceptible, because the nature of economic crisis means that countries are already in some level of crisis and some level of defense mechanism. That means they are primed to accept some level of advice, but they also want to save face, because very oftentimes a political structure or a group, that a government that accepts an IMF loan or bailout IMF conditions, have to face levels of political strife and levels of political questioning when it comes to recent elections. So what countries want is some level of balance between the both. They want the ability to save their economy so that they look politically palatable, but not at the expense of them sacrificing levels of sovereignty to the point where the public calls them incompetent and elects a new government. This is why it then requires to be a balance on both. And an IMF injection that puts their hand on the scale to shift the balance towards one or the other means that's a necessarily bad policy to begin with. But secondly, why does intrusive IMF control destroy nations' incentives? I want to know, the scale of control that CG themselves suggest is massive. It will indicate that IMF already controls some level of fiscal policy, some level of fiscal advice. To now control the complete operation of the central bank means that a vast majority of individuals just don't have control over the financial and economic sectors of their country. And this isn't something that is just hidden behind corporate bureaucrats or like corporate veils. These are actual impacts that individuals can see, because you require IMF officers, IMF officials to go into your country to take the role of like your Minister of Finance or the people running your central bank in order to have that level of significant control. Furthermore, you're also enacting policies that your politicians are actively saying are because of the IMF wanting to do this. It means the scale of control is massive, which has immense political ramifications for any government that wishes to accept the IMF that agrees with the level of mechanism that OG provides. What does this cause? First, this causes you to bristle against the scale of control already. It means individuals both on the government sector and the people on the ground become incredibly antagonistic towards the level of control they have to give up towards the IMF in order to save their economy. And I want to know, even if you want to argue later on that one is faster or slower, the problem is economic recovery takes time. Every second the IMF is there means that more negative capital is being gained by the people and by antagonistic politicians. But secondly, you probably lose trust politically as a government when you allow the IMF to do these kinds of things because the people therefore bristle against the level of control that's being held. But third, you also lose power. Like, you lose power in your important stakeholders within your country. Stuff like oligarchs now necessarily see their version of their money, or large corporations sees levels of the IMF control, meaning that you're no longer able to cater to your power bases as politicians. This proves why direct control is an issue, and very oftentimes it leads to countries not wanting that level of intervention. What is the impact? First, you get a vast majority of individuals to opt out from the IMF. So OG tries to handwave this and say that if they wanted Russia and China, they do so anyways. But this is the tipping point that pushes them away from the IMF. When the IMF says that only bailouts happen when you cede direct control over a large financial institution to us, that's when you push people away. Secondly, it leads to more economic turmoil. When you're opting into worse and worse forms of government debt, or worse forms of loans that are unregulated like AIB, that's when you lead to worse forms of economic turmoil. If OG is right and your ability to handle your country is so bad, the ability to get unregulated loans from individuals outside the IMF means that you are far worse off as support, which means the country becomes worse economic stability. But third, it leads to political upheaval. When the IMF comes in and takes over, even in your best case, leads to vast amounts of political upheaval and changing of governments and states, which means necessarily the IMF leads to worse forms. The IMF intervention actually leads to worse economic outputs because your economic state of a country is also very dependent on your political infrastructure. If your political infrastructure is failing because of the massive secession of control, losing a government power, that's when your economic crisis gets worse regardless of whatever policy you do. Why is the comparative better? Because you're beginning, number one, baseline control to a central bank within the state, which is better able to handle volatility, which I'll get to later. But secondly, the ability to take credit for saving the country, both economic recovery and establishing some level of political stability. That was important. I'll take OG before I get into my next point.
We already told you that there's unlikely to be political upheaval with the IMF because people lack trust in the government and they want an international actor to come in and take control.
Yeah, like both sides assert this. I proved to you why a balance is important. Like, you can disagree with all you want. Like, this is non-comparative. Next, why is the focus on monetary policy something that was unstrategic? And it's good that CG analyzes why states are like this to begin with because of debt problems and inflationary problems. But they failed to note that monetary policy is not the only way to handle inflation. Yes, you handle stuff like tax cuts and quantitative easing to handle the supply of money chains, but it's also about cutting government spending in as itself. And the level of scale of control that exists on CG just cannot manifest to the scale in which they happens, because the ability for the IMF to control multiple facets means there's a lot amount of time lag that happens, which is the very reason why the IMF picks one or the other in most instances where they have levels of bailout. Because the IMF has a large bureaucratic organization. They need to give the state some level of independence in order to operate itself while controlling some other aspects. Very oftentimes to pick and choose for the IMF, if not, just let the IMF buy the country for that matter. Like, I'm unclear why this is different. Why is monetary policy or a focus on the control of monetary policy harmful? First, it is incredibly holistic, which means it impacts all sectors of the economy equally. It means you're unable to be nuanced and specific with the way that you're targeting certain sectors, like fuel subsidies. Even if it pisses people off, it's probably the best way in order to target certain levels of what is seen useless government spending. Secondly, don't believe them when they say like it's a much faster, because it's not. Time lag means there's a slow scale of impact for monetary policies, because monetary policy is used to the circulation of money, which means a lot of times it's about recalling the vast amounts of money that's already gone out. That takes time, so it's not as quick as they want to claim it is. We think fiscal policies are much faster. But third, it is long term, because a lot of times your monetary policies are difficult to reverse and they're not volatile proof. That means they're not flexible, especially the nature of an economic crisis, which means when the IMF leaves, it's very hard for you to retain into what state sovereignty wants in terms of monetary policy, because reversing the decision takes a long time and takes a lot of capital to do so, which you suffer the effects even once you recover. Why is fiscal policy better? First, it's targeted by sector and its nuance, especially because states often handle things like agriculture by nostalgia. It's much better for the IMF to be an advisory body to tackle these things objectively. Secondly, the impacts are a lot faster working. When you cut government spending, there's just a lot of money just not going out into the economy. That means you cut circulation where it matters most. But third, it's also a short-term patch. You're able to pick and choose areas to wait and see approach, which means you get better flexibility, but also better reversibility of policies when it's better. It's directly in the IMF incentive. It controls the money they give.
All right, thank you so much for that speech, member for opposition. Now calling on government whip. Here.
Hi, I'm just confirming that I'm audible and visible.
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Great, thank you. If Teams would mind POIing me in the chat, that would be great. But obviously all good if you forget. I'll start by talking about our extension, then I'll weigh it against opening government, then I'll respond to closing opposition and then opening opposition. Let's start with our extension. First, I want to go over exactly how this extension fits into the debate because we prove three things. The first is we explain that on both sides, government spending is able to be controlled by the IMF because the IMF is able to impose fiscal conditions and fiscal policies on the government as a condition of their bailouts in the status quo, which neatly identifies then that our case is able to explain why monetary policy is crucial because you can harmonize it with the fiscal policy that the IMF is already doing. Secondly, we explain that in both inflationary crises and in recessions, which are the two by far most predominant contexts in which bailouts are necessary, you require the IMF to gain control in order of monetary policy in order to be able to fix those problems. And third of all, perhaps most crucially in our extension, we explain that these are far better than alternative measures in which you must rely solely on fiscal policies, like doing things like austerity measures in which you drastically cut welfare or fuel subsidies or things like that, because not only are they more direct and there is less collateral, but you're also able to attract more things like international investment in loans which is able to get your economy running in the longer term. We get three responses to this extension in the closing opposition's second extension, and I'll go through them now. The first response the closing opposition gives is to say, well, monetary policy is not the only way to control inflation. You can control inflation or things like that with fiscal policy. Obviously, that is true. That is the observation our extension makes, which is that yes, there are other ways to control inflation, but the problem is the IMF needs to be able to have all options available to them and be able to have that flexibility depending on the circumstance in order to make the most sensible and the most simplistic and the highest quality decisions. Because otherwise, yes, it's true that you could do things like fuel subsidies. Obviously, both teams agree that would have some control over inflation. But the problem is those often have terrible external externalities or things like that, or you don't want to do them to the degree in which closing opposition or opening opposition would be forced to, and balance that with things like, for example, allowing the central banks to change what interest rates they're offering. So it's about providing the IMF flexibility and being able to harmonize their policies so they can use both monetary and fiscal to be able to solve things. And I guess closing opposition realizes that, because the second rebuttal is just to say, well, because the IMF, it'll be too difficult to do both monetary and fiscal. They'll have to choose one, and that would be a problem. That is an insane claim. We are talking about one of the most well-resourced financial institutions in the world who is able to hire the people who are best situated to be able to make these decisions, who have the most information. And it is insane to suggest they would only be able to use one or the other. The problem at the moment is just that they can only use fiscal policies in order to put on conditions of their bailouts. We would far prefer, given that these are some of the most highly skilled people in the world who have all of the information available to them and who understand the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy, perhaps better than many governments in these situations, who would be able to make the best decisions. The final thing they say is just that these monetary policies are enacted too slowly, so they would prefer to do fiscal policies instead. First of all, I would make the very obvious observation that a lot of these monetary policies have immediate overnight effects, because yes, they are about kind of tangible differences in how much interest the central bank can set, which then influences all consumer-facing and business-facing banks, but it's also about managing expectations, so people know that the interest rate is going to rise or know that the interest rate is going to fall. That affects how they do how they spend, how they save, and how they make big purchases like mortgages or things like that, which means there absolutely are overnight effects because people look to the interest rates the central bank sets in order to do that. And that actually exposes one of the massive benefits in our extension, which is just that the IMF has highly predictable monetary policy. They're not likely to fluctuate in the way that a number of these central banks presumably must have been in order to cause the inflationary crises that have led to a bailout in the first place, which means that this leads to more reliable situations. I now want to weigh our extension above opening government, and I'll do so on 4 metrics. The first metric is just that opening government's metrics rely on change in control over government spending and fiscal policy in order to influence in order to get the impacts that they point to. But as we explained in our extension, those are available to both sides symmetrically in this debate because they're the kind of things that the IMF already attaches onto their conditions of bailouts, which means that we're better able to explain the change in this debate is about monetary policy and better able to fulfill the burden that our bench is required to meet. The second metric on which I weigh is just that they fail to provide the specifics of why this would be done well beyond why the IMF has incentives like, for example, their reputation and wanting to compete with places like China and Russia. And those are reasonable, but closing government is able to offer a better explanation of why this would be done well, because we point to the structure of the IMF itself in explaining that, for example, when the IMF does debt restructuring and things like that, they require the agreements of all parties who have a stake in that debt in the first place, so who are required to have a unanimous agreement on how that debt will be restructured, or kind of a debt restructuring as in like kind of how that debt will be managed into the future and what new conditions will be imposed on it. And even though each of those individual big countries like the US and China might have their own interests, those interests are very rarely aligned, which means that to get the US and China to agree on something, you're unlikely to be able to have either country gain a significant advantage in that circumstance. Third of all, we provide by far the most crucial mechanisms about how to manage currency, how to get more loans and more international investment, which is a massive benefit because it provides kind of a long-term solution for how these countries actually get themselves out of economic impoverishment in the first place. So even if the opening government can explain why the IMF would be able to manage things better, we are the team that is able to explain why you're able to get a sustainable circumstance into the long run and able to wean off reliance on the IMF into the future. But fourth of all, our scope is just far greater. As we highlight, this works even if the central bank is not extremely corrupt. They just have problems with how they're managing inflation. Whereas all of opening opposition's mechanisms require you to believe that these central governments are horribly corrupt in order to buy their logic on monetary policy. Next, I will respond to CO's first extension. They say that this needs to be less intrusive in order to be more palatable. First of all, they assume that more control equals more intrusion. But actually, our extension explains that less control is when you're able to do the most sensible policies rather than only relying on things that are available to you in the fiscal side, which is actually where you're able to get less intrusion into people's everyday lives. We also point out that is something that is far more palatable to people. They're far less likely to be angry when they have changes in interest rates rather than when their welfare is cut directly, because that's one of the only tools that the IMF has available to people on the opposition bench's side to be able to control the amount of consumer spending and therefore inflation in the economy. But third of all, why is palatability more important than returning the economy to normalcy? We are in a situation where the IMF bailouts are an absolute last resort. This is after you can't go to China and you can't go to Russia and you have no other option. This means that countries are in dire economic circumstances, even if it is unpalatable. We just do not understand why it is worth sacrificing the economy of these countries into the long term. That is also something that is unpalatable to people. But finally, I want to respond to opening opposition's claims. The first they make is that this causes distrust in institutions, which makes the economy worse. But they fail to prove that the people whose distrust matters, i.e. larger investors who are actually able to kickstart the economy, do distrust this. And our extension explains the IMF is far more reliable. It's seen as more trustworthy. It's seen as more prudent and more pragmatic, which is why having that involvement and having the certainty that the fiscal policy, monetary policy, will be managed well is a good thing. Second of all, they say that sovereignty is most important. First of all, they spend a lot of time proving why sovereignty is important without actually proving why it is significantly violated in this debate. And even though that impacting might be very persuasive, it is not linked to the actual change in this policy. Second of all, they explain that there are other options. We explain that if there are other options, as OO says, that it's not sovereignty that you're losing, it's just the ability for people to opt in when a situation is really dire. The IMF doesn't have to use control. They only do so if there is essentially a disaster, which explains why our extension is able to beat out OOs. Oh, I wasn't offered a POI. I'm sorry, so I didn't take one, but proud to govern.
Thank you for that speech, Government Whip. Now to conclude the debate, calling on Opposition Whip. Here.
All right, hi, am I visible and audible?
Yep, you're visible and audible.
Okay, cool. I'll take a POI from opening, preferably in the 5th minute onwards. Then if there's none from opening, I'll take one from closing. One sec. Okay. The first thing I want to draw attention to is the wording of this motion. This motion is a dishouse belief there. I'm going to explain to you why closing government's case cannot fly for multiple different reasons. The first thing to note is to necessarily argue that a large chunk of the problems coming up from CG is very simple, that CG is asking for too much. Then necessarily to have control over both your fiscal policy and your monetary policy is too large of a burden for states to even want to opt into your process. This is important noting the motion, because the motion argues to you that there's some level of choice, right? And this was clearly pointed out within opening opposition, but expanded within closing opposition, which is the explanation as to why probably those states that we're talking about are looking for bailouts will probably look into alternatives like the AIIB, noting that competition is becoming far more rampant and other forms of bailouts still exist. Therefore, more likely than not, a large chunk of CG's case cannot fly, noting that the monetary policy that we want to talk about when it comes to direct control is one that's very intrusive. That's why Wesley's extension is very important to talk about political turmoil that exists by virtue of this, because it completes the analysis coming out from opening opposition as to why they wouldn't opt into the IMF in the first place and why necessarily this means that the IMF loses its reputation, loses its things. Because if it's true the IMF already has a bad reputation in status quo, this makes it far worse on scale, right? Necessarily because now you're asking for more monetary policy. But I'll explain to you as to why monetary policy is intrusive as opposed to just asserting this reality. The first thing to note is that the failure of Gov is to actually bravely deal with how monetary policy is actually look like, right? Because the reality of monetary policy is that it's holistic in nature, and large chunk of the problem is that it's not targeted. So when OG attempts to tell you that but we can target certain sectors, this is a fiscal policy instead of monetary policy. Monetary policy is the control of your supply of the money that flows within the country. The problem with monetary policy and why this is bad is necessarily how it affects all stratas of society. How does this look like on multiple different folds? Number one, the problem when, for example, you're increasing interest rate, and they're right, that is probably one of the most effective ways to deal with inflation, is that necessarily it's insensitive to the realities of people on the ground. That people who oftentimes are poor are unable to now purchase houses or get cars or get loans in the first place by virtue of how monetary policy affects their lives. This means that the first people to go when you're able to control monetary policy is always the people at the poorest level. The problem here is that IMF doesn't have a direct correlation to those people. So when you talk about numbers, the poorest of the poor doesn't matter to the IMF. The poorest of the poor are the first to go and don't really care because this is something that they don't owe an obligation towards. The reality here is that because states has a direct dynamic between both the individuals that they have to protect and also the economy, means that they're more likely to be hesitant to this and more likely to opt out of your bailout in the first place. This directly proves to you as to why this is bad. But secondly, let's just explain to you how monetary policy holistically affects everything else as well. Because their argumentation and note that their pathway to victory is hinged on one very simple concept, which was FDI. This is a problematic idea because monetary policy can attract some level of FDI. This is true because you can control your currency. You are able to maybe attract some more FDI. The question then becomes, how trackable is this? The comparative, however, in opening opposition was very clear. Closing opposition was very clear from Wesley. The reality of fiscal policies and the controls that the levers of control that you have over industries makes certain things fly better. Number one, the ability for you through not perfect information, but better, greater access to information to be able to throw away industries which are probably not as efficient. I.e., if your agriculture industry is one of nostalgia and something that's not necessarily the most economically efficient industry, these are the places that go first. This means that sure, we will bite the bullet and say there are levels of people that will be affected by fiscal policies that happen via IMF policies, but these are groups of individuals that are largely very not as large as monetary policy. This means a large chunk of the problems that exist within Gov is naturally the scale of harm that happens. We comparatively have a smaller scale of harm the moment in time where fiscal policy can directly affect the most efficient ways to throw away the rod within your economy. But secondly here, when it comes to fiscal policy, is also how you're able to track advancements. The reality around monetary policy is because of how arbitrary and subjective it is. You're dependent on multiple different external factors like your FDI, like other individuals, or like generally people being able to cope with this monetary policy changes, your interest rates changing, and being able to somehow get results out of this. The comparative on fiscal policy is how these levers of control are better. This then proves why the IMF is more likely to be happy with this policy or retaining status quo. Because necessarily what happens in fiscal policy is, for example, you are taking out an industry and you're changing or you're controlling government spending. Maybe in the worst case of scenarios, you're taking away welfare. These are things that are quantifiable and trackable. You're able to see where this money flows to. And this means that this also allows for the loaners that we talk about, or the borrowers, or the people who give, or the funders of this IMF to be able to see where that money goes to and the trajectory as to how naturally an economy would recover. The reality here is that the economic recovery coming out from both Gov benches is extremely vague and nebulous. They don't explain to you how this process actually looks like. In fiscal policy, it's much more clearer. You tax certain industries, you throw out certain industries, you rebuild new industries, and necessarily how sectors like that create a symbiosis between one another and finally create some form of recovery. At the very least, this trajectory, even if it's far slower as compared to government, is something that's far more tangible, something that you can see. I'll take that POI from opening.
The reason why monetary policy is important is because the IMF can use their expertise to control things like interest and exchange rates in a volatile economy. This is not something that you can replicate with fiscal policies.
Okay, yeah, but I've explained to you why that isn't as efficient as using fiscal policy anyway. But secondly, this debate also requires you to talk about the opt-in. The reality is that states just don't want to opt in if you're going to control every aspect of their life. If you're going to control just the monetary policy, noting that how it affects other different things, people are more willing to choose fiscal policy, and you're going to lose out to AIB anyway. You're losing to OO's case already. But lastly then, and to explain and to tie everything into explaining why political instability is the key winning tipping point within this debate, is to understand necessarily what it looks like when it comes to internally and why political turmoil leads to further destruction as opposed to some form of recovery that CG and OG wants to talk to you about. The reality around political turmoil is the buy-in to those policies. If individuals are unhappy with your government, are willing to kick out the people who are now running your country, the central banks, etc., this means you don't get any cooperation. The reality of the civic government engagement has to be very clear, that the only way in which you're able to change or achieve some form of economic recovery comes from the synthesis of both the people and the government and the IMF. If the IMF is seen as a foreign actor that's trying to take control of every aspect of your life, it's more likely than not the individuals will just likely push you away, or not likely adhere to the rules that you're trying to attempt, or more likely than not attempt to overthrow governments and lead towards like uprisings, etc. This problem here naturally proves to you that on their side, any forms of tangible change is very arbitrary, more likely than not to not happen. This House believes that debate engaged on all stakeholders.
All right, thank you for that speech, Opposition Whip, and that now concludes the debate. So debaters may now cross the House. I'll be back in 15 minutes.